So my first Radiohead review was of course OK Computer, widely regarded as the band's masterpiece or even the greatest album ever to some, giving a much needed injection of freshness to alternative rock. This was Radiohead's third album. Going back to their second album, you can see the foundations of OK Computer being laid out. While the Bends was more guitar focused, it still showed a more arty approach to alt rock. Their debut album on the other hand, well, that was basically just straight up grunge. Welcome back to another
Radiohead, Radiohead.
Yeah, that. Let's start in order of release because their debut album is a pretty curious case. It's The Black Sheep, either largely forgotten or disliked by critics, Radiohead fans, and Radiohead members alike. Yet, it does have their most recognisable song. This is the story of Pablo Honey. Nevermind kicked down the door for a whole lot of other guitar-driven weirdos in the early 90s to release that one single that most people would come to know them for. Some would go on to create more influence besides that one song, while others are still mostly remembered for it alone. Radiohead looked set to be the latter with Creep, especially since they looked pretty content with riding the grunge wave while it was giving them their first taste of success, until they got burnt out and felt the need to change things up, as Tom York and co have done many times since. There weren't really any British bands doing the whole grunge thing at all back then, as far as I can tell, especially since Britpop seemed to partly stem from a hate for grunge. The only other British band I could think of doing the whole grunge thing back then was Bush, but they sound so desperate to be American that I didn't even know they were English until around 1 or 2 years ago. Gavin Rossdale was even married to an American woman for about 15 years. You know, that's enough to fool me. But Tom York never hid his accent, and Radiohead have always been distinctly British. Even when some of the biggest influences of early Radiohead were Pixies, Dinosaur Jr. and Sonic Youth, they had a melodic style and a sort of tenderness that was a little closer to bands like The Smiths and U2. But the thing is, if you heard Creep, then you already have an idea of what most of Pablo Honey's gonna sound like. So it lives in infamy as Radiohead's least boundary-pushing album. But it gets a bit of a raw deal. It doesn't really deserve the amount of dislike it currently gets. I think people just don't feel comfortable because it doesn't exactly fit in with their traditional sound. And the other albums put all these expectations on Pablo Honey that it doesn't meet because it's just a good, simple rock album. But there's still a bunch of flaws to it, which I'll get into gradually. Much of the album makes use of the sudden shift from loud to quiet, with clean guitars and York's soft voice in the verses before the triple distorted guitar attack kicks in again. The opening track, You, is a fine example of this, but it also has this triple time shuffle thing going on that makes it a little more distinct. Meanwhile, a couple of the songs like Anyone Can Play Guitar and Ripcord are loud and fairly obnoxious for the most part. But there's also the typical nearly drumless acoustic guitar track in Thinking About You. Other than that, it seems like Johnny Greenwood couldn't physically make it through their early songs without having to thrash at his guitar. Case in point, the track Stop Whispering is apparently a kind of tribute to the Pixies, though instrumentally and dynamically, the opening couple of minutes sound closer to a band like R.E.M. But it starts to build in dynamic, and then Johnny starts wailing again to introduce another explosion of guitars. Now, I'm the last person to reject some good, loud, fuzzy guitars, but on Stop Whispering, this shift back to heaviness just feels a bit forced somehow. Sometimes a song could be better off without introducing some big guitars or other louder instruments, you know. So when I checked out the full collector's edition of Pablo Honey, I realized that I actually preferred the US single version of Stop Whispering to the original. It has the louder guitars pushed more into the background, it has some strings this time, and the louder ending isn't as full on. I feel like this suits the song a whole lot better. I love pretty much all of that grungy, slacker type stuff from the 90s, and this album should have been a great fit for me. But in the end, Pablo Honey does stuff that a ton of other 90s bands did better, as well as stuff that the band themselves would do a hell of a lot better later. There's even a surprising lack of really memorable hooks here. I mean, they tried to follow up the hit single Creep with Anyone Can Play Guitar, which has possibly one of the dullest choruses they've ever written. But I still need to give the album some credit. There aren't any massive highs, but none of the songs here are completely unlistenable. I was always pretty indifferent to Creep after hearing it when I was younger, but once I finally listened to Pablo Honey, it started to win me over with Johnny's badass guitar and Tom absolutely killing those high notes. He does a pretty awesome drawn out high note on You as well. Even the song How Do You, which I think is the worst song on the album according to a lot of people, I quite enjoy it, even though it feels a little unfinished and maybe overly goofy. But it's 10 10 times better than a song like Lurgy. Let's not kid ourselves, people. Prove Yourself is one of the tracks on the album that sticks with me the most for whatever reason. It feels like the catchiest song on the album. Probably would have made a better follow-up to Creep than Anyone Can Play Guitar, I guess. And it does have a pretty awesome closing track in Blowout. And it does pretty much live up to its name as it ends with these big, shrieking, reverberating guitars, like you're in some sort of fever dream. So whether you're a huge fan of other Radiohead albums, or just a fan of 90s alternative in general, and if you don't go into Pablo Honey with massively high expectations, then you are definitely going to enjoy it in some way, I'm sure. Now, as you probably know, Radiohead quickly grew to resent Creep, and got pretty tired with their whole general approach as well. So for the next album, they teamed up with English indie producer John Leckie, and also met their future executive producer Nigel Godrich, who was apparently a huge influence towards the band doing things a little differently. And the result of that was their 1995 sophomore album, The Bends.
Baby's got the bends. Oh no.
Similarly to how Creep gives you a good idea of what Pablo Honey is like, the first 30 seconds of opening track Planet Telex immediately tell you that this is already quite a different band from the first album. They started using keyboards for the first time, the guitars started to expand beyond a basic fuzz tone, Tom York sounds like he's found some new confidence in his singing rather than sound like he's moping most of the time, and the song has this unique mid-tempo swagger when Pablo Honey was more a mix of frantic rushing and plodding along. The Bends is Radiohead starting to find their own sound, and their strengths. They were finally writing some real soaring melodies, and executing the quieter moments so much more effectively. And Johnny Greenwood was starting to nail that middle ground between technicality and weirdness in his lead guitar parts. It's a proper middle ground between Pablo Honey's driven guitar rock and OK Computer's experimentation. And honestly, I like it more than both those albums, partly for that reason. So there's an album that's like OK Computer, but it rocks even harder? Well, I'm sold. While most of the Bends adopts a more cryptic approach to songwriting compared to their debut, there's still a couple of more straightforward rockers, including two of my favourite tracks on the record, Bones and Black Star. Bones absolutely rips. Might just be the heaviest song in the band's whole catalogue from what I've heard, but Black Star is possibly my second favourite song on the album. Seems like it's severely underrated by most people. Then again, it is one of the more basic songs on the album. Dare I say it sounds kind of like Britpop even, but that doesn't stop it from being fantastic. High and Dry is another track that is fairly simple and poppy as hell, but that isn't a bad thing at all when you have a solid gold chorus like this does. The conviction and emotion that Tom York shows in that chorus is almost unheard of on the entirety of Pablo Honey. Though funnily enough, this song was actually recorded during the Pablo Honey era, but dismissed until the band worked on the Bends. So I guess they never had a problem with writing a high-quality mellow song after all. They just had a problem with decision-making. The title track has some of Johnny's best ever shredding to date. On the other hand, the introduction of his noisy lead feels a little out of place on the, unsurprisingly, dreamy Nice Dream. But the song is definitely still a pass. Bulletproof, I Wish I Was, is the better song in that style of performance, with Johnny and Ed O'Brien creating this sort of icy background atmosphere with their guitars. And Street Spirit Fade Out is one that took a little more time to appreciate since it's not all that flashy, and is also a hell of a downer, which I don't think is something you'd normally want from the last track on the album. But it is still a bit of an earworm in its own bleak way. The other songs I haven't talked about on the album are great as well, of course, but I just want to single out one more song, and I'm saving the best for last. Might seem like a bit of a cop-out, because it might be the most popular song from the album, but Fake Plastic Trees is currently one of my favourite songs ever. Everything about it just comes together perfectly. The synth, the strings, the gradual introduction of all the instruments, followed by the stripped-back ending, and of course, Tom York's stellar voice. So there you go, I like the Bends more than OK Computer. I know I'd be pretty far from alone in saying that, but I know it probably isn't popular opinion. Of course, I've always been a huge fan of the classic alternative rock sound that the Bends is closer to, but I'm definitely not saying that OK Computer is not as good because it's more experimental. I think it just comes down to the fact that the songs on the Bends grabbed me a little more than the ones on OK Computer did.